This evening we are beginning a three-part series since the last Friday in November is the day after Thanksgiving, which long ago we have denominated a Gnostic and National Digestion Day. And so first is Turkey Day, then there is Digestion Day. So the Friday after Thanksgiving we usually don't have a program. But other than, and this one is on an old hobby horse of mine, which I've been working on for decades. And I think by next Friday or the third Friday I'll give you some of my recent discoveries in this particular field, which to me were really quite spectacular. They might not be for you. And it has to do with the mystery of the Black Madonnas and with the deific feminine principle itself. But tonight we'll introduce it, and then we will go on from there. Now, one thing is really very important to remember, and that is that whether we admit it or not, or whether we like it or not, the overwhelming majority of circumstances and phenomena in this manifest world are characterized by a certain duality, which means not only that here is one pole of the duality, there is another pole of the duality, which is also true, but that the seemingly unitary beings themselves are polar in various ways. And this, of course, has been noted by human beings since the beginning of time, and it has strongly influenced the view of both the physical and of the metaphysical worlds that people developed. We are, of course, all aware that in classical antiquity, and for that matter, even in non-classical contemporaneity in many parts of the world, including India, including Japan, and so forth, the principle of duality has been recognized as being present or being projected onto the super-physical world, namely the world of the gods and of the goddesses, and right there you have the duality, this dual vision was not done away with, although certainly there have been strong maneuvers exerted in that direction, has not been done away with by the Semitic religiosity of Jews, Christians, and ultimately of Islam that came forth from the Middle East. It is still there. If you go to, I haven't been there, but I have some of the artifacts. If you go to places like Morocco, particularly, one of the most common artifacts in all price ranges that you can buy is a hand with some Arabic writing on it. And the hand is symbolically the hand of Fatima, who was the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on his name, and let's say all the great leaders, both religious and secular, of Islam in the Middle East and in Asia blood relatives of the daughter of the prophet. Why? Well, for one thing, he didn't have any sons. But let us say so even in a very masculine-oriented culture, and maybe similarly masculine-oriented spirituality, the feminine appears in various ways and often appears very prominently. Now, such, of course, I'm just flim-flamming at the beginning now. Such, of course, has been certainly also the fate of Christendom, where the most, I would say, in many cases, in Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox spirituality, the most prominent and the well-nigh central figure is what in Greek is called the Theotokos, the Mother of God, or the Blessed Virgin Mary in Roman Catholic terminology. Take away this figure from both of these religions, and I would venture a guess, and it's only a guess, that both forms of the Eastern and Western Christianity would, if not collapse like a house of cards, but undergo a very, very rapid decline. So let's say that the feminine principle has always been present. It is, of course, understood in more or less modern. We don't know now what is modern, what is postmodern, what is pre-modern. The word has lost its meaning, but we certainly have learned in the era where in-depth psychology came to the fore, especially in the culminating event of depth psychology as enunciated by C.G. Jung, that the possible roots, or at least the parallel, as in French we call the pendant of this duality, exists very, very powerfully in the human psyche. Beginning with the sort of quasi-archetypes that Jung spoke about, the anima and the animus, but going on from there into deeper and deeper realms. Now, we need to remind ourselves, if that is possible, that the psyche, the soul, because that's after all the English word for the Greek psyche, as we learn to pronounce it, the psyche, that the psyche is the origin of practically everything that is meaningful in external reality, or the psyche has a capacity to pour forth, to project its own meaning onto external circumstances, and thereby creates a more or less meaningful reality within which we can live. Now, when we proceed by way of various psychological techniques deeper and deeper into the human psyche, into what since Sigmund Freud already became known as the unconscious, das Unbewusste. That was his word. We got to give him credit for that, although of course Jung and Adler and Stekel and all the rest of them picked it up, that the deeper and deeper we proceed into the great cavern of the psyche, the more powerful and creative these dual principles appear to us. Why? Because now they take on the character, or they are of the character of what again Jung called the archetypes, in German the Urbilder, which just really means ancient picture, ancient image, and these ancient images very much partake of this duality. And so it is rather understandable that even though, let's say, monotheistic religions, or at least religions that in their origins are monotheistic, maybe rigidly monotheistic. One of the most important mantras, if you want to use that term, that's a Hindu term, of Islam is that Allah is one. And of Judaism, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And so it's, let's say, there is a denial or a powerful push against that duality, but in some fashion the duality reasserts itself and is there. Now, that's sort of a general principle upon the veracity I think most observant and thinking people can more or less agree. Now then, that being the case, we need to observe how this duality comes forth and reasserts itself and appears in various ways in our field of observation as time goes on. And that being the case, I will jump now forward into more recent history, and I will, because I intend to read a very significant quotation from him a little later anyway, and I think that his vision, at least in this particular regard, has been very important. There was an astonishing individual in our culture who died not terribly long ago. I think probably in the 70s, or at the most in the 80s. He got to be quite old, and that was Robert Graves. Maybe not too many people know about him nowadays, but Robert Graves was a universal genius and an extremely fascinating and amusing individual. English, of course, although he lived much of his later life in Mallorca, where the climate, I believe, is much nicer than in England, and he was a strange combination of a historian, a poet, and a mythologist and a myth maker himself. If you catch on to any of his books, especially the big ones, you will be fascinated. He became quite famous the world over, the English-speaking world primarily, in the 1960s and the 1970s by way of a book that he wrote entitled The White Goddess. If you want to read something fascinating, it certainly is. Another one, which is of course more on the masculine side, is his book about Jesus, which is called King Jesus. Now all of these are a mixture of his poetic imagination, of history, and of various myths which he studied very, very assiduously. They're absolutely fascinating. Now, I need to pick up on his contribution in the White Goddess. Actually, he availed himself always of all sorts of scholarship. He was a fantastic scholar as well as poet and mythologist that were available at his time. And he no doubt picked up on the, well, how should we put it, the quasi-historical or imaginatively historical work, great big one, of the Swiss-German scholar Johann Jakob Backhofen. Now, Johann Jakob Backhofen wrote a theory which he expanded on very greatly of the religious development primarily of humanity and of the ancestors of our culture, but maybe other cultures as well. And the theory is like this. Now, I'm not associating myself with it, but the theory is like this, that when human spirituality, human religiosity rises, the first deity, overwhelming deity, is always female. Now, he had some proof that points in that direction, but it wasn't an awful lot. And this is the theory of the Great Mother. And that for a very, very long period of time, primitive humanity is attached to the figure of this Great Mother, and that is, so to say, I mean, he didn't use that term yet, the archetype, and then history changes, and of course this is tied in with various mundane changes, such as changing from hunting and gathering lifestyle to agricultural lifestyle, and so on, so wherein the Great Mother is, so to say, dethroned. She is no longer the supreme deity, although in some fashion she is still there. Or as he put it, the sons revolt against the mother. The sons being probably the lesser masculine gods, like a lot of the Greek gods and so forth, and perhaps humanity in general. And that goes on for a very long time, and eventually it sort of culminates in the monotheism, which still inherits the gender characteristics of the masculine gods who replaced the Great Mother. But the Great Mother now becomes obscured. Now this was a very, Backhofen wrote in the late 19th century, it was a very popular theory for quite a while. And this is sort of the deity, this Great Mother Goddess, whom Robert Graves in the 20th century named the White Goddess, in the main. So his White Goddess is writing about where and in what vestigial forms and in what myths and what stories all over the world one can find the remnants of this Great Mother, whom he named the White Goddess. All right. This is maybe an awful long introduction to what I'm trying to drive at, and which is that Robert Graves himself came to the conclusion, and by, let's see, when did he, right, I think by 1960, I can have the book right here, what am I looking at? 1965, he wrote a lecture which then was expanded by other essays in his book, wherein he discerned that he maybe overstated his case, and that in fact that there was another goddess who in fact was coming forth at this particular time, whom he named the Black Goddess. And I'll read you the key quotation from there. And one of the main reasons for the blackness being certainly not any kind of a racial business, but that she's still in the dark. She's coming out from the dark, and that she's different from the white goddess. And she is likely in the mythic imagination of humanity, she is likely to replace the white goddess. Now all the people who paid money and got terribly excited about his book, The White Goddess, didn't like that addition, but he definitely came forth with it. Now, yet another little chapter added to this saga is the fact that just about the time when Robert Graves began to write about the Black Goddess, an interest arose. These are synchronicities of history, which cannot be denied, and which, like all synchronicities, are meaningful. Although it takes some work to discover their meanings, So just about that time, an interest developed, in part out of art historical considerations, but also others, religious and spiritual, maybe even psychologically, in the numerous figures of the Black Madonnas, which are scattered all over Europe. I lived in a relatively small, part of my, only a few years of my life, part of a town which at that time was southern Hungary, prior to that was Yugoslavia, now is Serbia. Heaven knows what will it be in the future. In any event, very near our house was a big, massive church of the Franciscan order, sort of very Latin-looking, with all the steps going up and so forth. And in there was a Black Madonna. It was a sort of a a relief, an icon in a frame, which, however, was not flat, but stood out. And it was, like so many others, a miraculous Madonna. All the wall around it was full of plaques of gratitude given by people who experienced healings there. So I was confronted with a Black Madonna, in that sense, quite early in life. And then I learned that there are a whole lot of others, and they are scattered all over in the various countries. Probably one of the most prominent that I ever heard of is the one in Einsiedeln in Switzerland, which is also in a monastery, a Benedictine monastery, and it is a miraculous Madonna. And the monastery of Einsiedeln has two other distinctions, one of them being that was the place and the building where one of the most fascinating periods of the late Middle Ages, I can still pride myself of knowing his long name, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Paracelsus Bombastus of Hohenheim, namely Paracelsus. Well, Paracelsus was born and grown up. And the second distinction being that a man who might justifiably be called the new Paracelsus of the 20th century, namely Carl Gustav Jung, was extremely fond of the place in Einsiedeln and went there many, many times. And when there was some big Paracelsus jubilee, some commemorative feast of Paracelsus' life, Jung gave a very famous lecture on Paracelsus in Einsiedeln, and it's in his collective writings. So let's say the Black Madonnas were there all along. People didn't quite know what to do with them. But let's say, I'm sure somewhat under Robert Graves' inspiration, if not influence, number of people became interested now in what a more profound and perhaps more psycho-spiritual meaning might be concealed in these Black Madonnas. You know, there were people always, the first thing people think about is some really trivial, stupid thing, because I think the trivial mind is the most accessible part of the mind to us. So, you know, we are all, we all have a tendency toward triviality, which we need to overcome. And so, you see, one of the theories was then, by the way, probably the second most important and very, very important in the Latin world is the Black Madonna of Montserrat in Spain. Very, very important. And that is a statue. Very, very rigid. It's almost in its rigidity, it reminds you of the Egyptian statues. And after all, Spain is not that terribly far from Egypt, just across the ocean. But in any event, now people, the first, the way they wanted to chase the idea away was that, well, in all of these churches they burned so much incense that it turned the faces of the Madonnas black. Well, you know, I'm afraid that's not how it went. They were, no doubt in some cases they were first lighter, and then with the passage of the centuries they became darker, but then people came and singled them out as very, very important sacred statues because they were black. In fact, there was, well, I'm sure he's still alive, he wasn't that old, there's a Jungian analyst and scholar in England by the name of Ian Begg, B-E-G-G, and Ian Begg wrote a singularly insightful and particularly in the Jungian sense insightful book about the Black Madonnas. In it he has a complete list. This man traveled around for years before he collected them all. He has a complete list of all the Black Madonnas, well, at least in Europe, maybe in the world. He's a very nice man. I have never met him. The reason I call him a very nice man is because he wrote a very laudatory review of one of my books. And this stamps him as a very nice man right there, you know. In any event, now, Ian Begg undoubtedly has read some Robert Graves. But Ian Begg indicates that the presence, and from time to time, like right now, the rising prominence of the Black Madonnas has a psychohistorical meaning, that a deific feminine figure that is still in the dark is coming out of the dark and take the place, just like has been indicated by some, as it takes the place of the white goddess. Now, in order to differentiate them properly, we need to remember that what Bachhofen was postulating, and by the name Bachhofen means a baking oven, as those of my friends who speak German will remember, from which I and some others who are critical of Bachhofen have deduced that maybe some of his theories are half-baked. In any event, you know, Bachhofen had great influence, but let's say he has been, surpassed. But whether it's Bachhofen's great mother, or whether it's Robert Graves' white goddess and things like that, we need to keep in mind that the archaic, the most ancient, because that's what they went back to, most ancient goddess figures and goddess mythologies are pretty primitive and pretty terrifying. You know, the great goddess of prehistoric times wasn't a nice, kindly mama, but she was fond of human sacrifices, fond of eating children. You know, the Baal figure of all of these are in Robert Graves, of Babylon and so forth, was feminine at one time too, and so it's not a very friendly picture. She's somebody that you might be justly scared of, certainly a change, let us say, into something more benign was a fortunate development, and is a fortunate development of such it is. Now something else, and I will bring these strings together, but you will have to bear with me, because it will take me probably till next week and the week thereafter that I can outline a scheme, which this is something that came to me on the basis of some things that I came across really quite recently, and that therefore I'm sort of excited about it, but I'm leading up to it now. Now it would seem that undoubtedly on the basis of transcendental experiences, because we have to take that always into account. I mean, religious and spiritual systems, mythologies of a spiritual character are not invented. They are discovered. Discovered by whom and how? Discovered by people who are, psychonauts, spiritual nauts, travelers in the inner world, who have the capacity to receive impressions, visions, sometimes even communications from parts of universal being which are ordinarily not available to us, ordinarily not visible to us. These are the seers and the sages, the prophets. As you trace them back in history, eventually you end up with the shamans. The word shaman being of Siberian origin, but you know, the fellows who are out there in the tundra dancing with their, I don't know, sort of their Siberian castanets and going into trances, among whom I think I can number the ancestors of my people, the Hungarians, because that's what they were when they came to their present habitat, and took a long time for them to change. In any event, that's sort of the developmental scheme, at least meaningfully suggested. First we have the shaman, then the shaman develops into sort of primitive prophecy, and after the prophecy come more archetypal figures, avatars, saviors, people like Jesus Christ, people like the prophet Mani, for instance, to use sort of people from our own tradition and all of that. And then you have the sort of the flower of the revelatory flower has unfolded, because these things are, you could use a metaphor for a lot of psycho-spiritual developments. Maybe we need the heat on again. That has nothing to do with the shaman, but that there is an unfoldment, there is a development, and so now we might say that the primitive mother goddess, who incidentally has been unearthed and made much of by the feminists and their kith and kin in the 60s and thereabouts, because it was a feminine goddess. Well, but the issue being that the dark side, and by this one here we mean, let's say, the primitive malefic side was thereby neglected and not paid any attention to. Gods, whether they are like the Greek gods, whether they are like the others, have their off-putting side. I mean, Kronos eats his children, eats them alive, and Kronos is a very great god in the Greek pantheon. His name also means time, and he is the god of time. And of course, there you can see the higher symbolism wherein, time eats up the years, as we well know. And then we wonder in the midst of Kronos eating his children as to why our hair turns white and why we undergo changes that in our own bodies, and so that we are not particularly fond of, because one of the ways that Kronos eats his children is to make us old and then make us die. So there are off-putting deities, in many different places. And a friend of mine who has a pretty good, he's a pretty good jester. He makes wonderful jokes. He's in New York. Had said when this, a lot of this feminine goddess making was. Feminist goddess making was taking place, he said, he says, they are going to create for us a Ms. Jehovah. Because it comes. Really, I mean, I certainly don't mean to cast aspersions on the Jewish faith or anything of that sort. After all, I studied Kabbalah for years. But let's say the biblical deity, the Old Testament deity, is not a very attractive fellow. And he has proclivities of character which are pretty scary and pretty off-putting. And but the monotheistic image has imprinted itself so much on the culture that we put up with that. We consider that divine. And the Jewish people, who are very astute people, the Jewish people found a theological way, and you give it up to those rabbis, they figure out everything. They figured out a way in which they said, look, the Lord God, Adonai, has two sides. He has a good side, he has a bad side. They are called the Yezirim and that we have to, if we are going to accept him as our God, we have to put up with both. It's not a bad way of looking at it. But in any event, it's a difficult deity. But the monotheistic image arising out of the Old Testament to begin with had, let's say, had made such an impact, because after all it also infiltrated, let us say, infiltrated the Christian religion, that you have an ambivalent and scary deity, and that, but the people who want to make a new religion, or they think they are restoring something very old, they use the same kind of difficult and off-putting characteristics that they find in the Old Testament deity, and then they make a goddess, or they look for a goddess who is very similar. And that's why my friend said, Ms. Jehovah, Now then, however, and now I'm beginning, because soon I will read to you a little myth that, believe it or not, I wrote myself. So you better, gird up your loins for it. But it, one has to be careful. In fact, something comes to my mind that I sort of zeroed in when I read it. I like to read sort of scary literature and things like that. And so I was very fond of the book The Interview with a Vampire, which you may remember, In fact, I just happened to be in New Orleans when the movie The Interview with a Vampire was premiering in the movie theaters. You should have seen it. The great big banners on the streets with vampire faces with teeth. It was more fun than a dozen Halloweens, In any event, Anne Rice, who lived originally in San Francisco. In any event, Anne Rice wrote in the book, there's a certain scene, it may even be in the sequel, I'm not so sure anymore, wherein the protagonists somehow make contact with a couple of old Egyptian gods. And among them there is a goddess which he names Akasha, which I always thought was silly because it's a bona fide name of a particular region of the cosmos in Hindu theology, but anyway, what the heck. So they unearthed this ancient goddess and somehow bring her back to life. And there is some wise person there who warns these people and says, look, you can do that, but how do you know that you are not reviving a dangerous ancient demon, a vampire goddess, who is going to be a great problem to humanity? Watch out before you revive some of these old archetypes, shall we say. And that's true. One has to be careful with that. So that now, let's say, we're in prehistoric times or moving into historical times, and there are changes, and the polytheistic religions, because the ancient Persian religion was polytheistic too. It was only when the Zarathustra Reformation did away with the devas, because they were very closely related to the Hindus. And then brought one god, Ahura Mazda, that changed. But so when all of those times that were sort of coalescing and changing maybe from the cruel old mother goddess to other deities and so forth, and something strange seems to have happened. But now you've got to trust my myth-making, my own myth-making faculties. I don't claim that these things are historical, but somewhere, and I don't think from another part of the world, but rather out of the invisible worlds, there came yet another deific feminine figure. People came to recognize, and it came to various places. You find remnants of it in Hinduism. You find remnants of it, for instance, in Sufism, because as Pir Vilayat, Sufi leader, mentioned. He mentioned to me in a private conversation, I don't know about others, that let's say the esoteric Sufi leadership always believed that the Sufis were not Muslims to begin with. That there was an original tradition, which when the Muslims took over everything, the Sufis had to make up their minds, okay, we either say, yes, we are Muslims, or we are not going to have a head. And the choice in that case is not so difficult to make, But so that's probably a real ancient tradition, which had a feminine deific figure, but of a very different character. And is slowly infiltrated into some of the existing religions. And one of the ways that it did that, for instance, was that it appeared in among the Hebrew religion as a mysterious figure called Chokhmah, which means wisdom, and an entire literature which is included in the latter part of the Old Testament, namely the wisdom literature. There is this deific feminine figure speaking in the first person and giving forth scriptures such as the Book of the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, a whole number of these, so that was one manifestation. Other manifestations elsewhere. Finally, when we come to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, it appears among the Gnostic Christians as Sophia, which is the Greek word for Chokhmah. And one of the greatest teachers really about Sophia, there were others, I mean Valentinus probably was the greatest, but was a Jew, Philo Judaeus, Philo of Alexandria, who sort of, and he is regarded as a great Platonic Jewish philosopher to the present time, and who really said that there are two principles that make everything run in the universe. Two great principles are wisdom and the word, Logos and Sophia. This is Philo's theology, it's Jewish. So let's say some kind of a deific figure was coming out of the dark at that time. But then with the suppression of the Gnostic and Gnosticizing, let's say, religious movements, it went into obscuration again. And it became, perhaps one of its symbols became the Black Madonna. But now I'm going to have to take the liberty, I don't think that I have ever did this in public, it's not long, of reading to you my own version of the myth of Sophia, which is of course based in the Pistis Sophia and otherwise. But these are my words and sometimes my ideas. So if you think that I have overstepped, if the bounds have been overstepped, then blame it on me and not on Valentinus or not on Philo, okay? But I felt at one time that I should sort of write my own short story about Sophia and her possible reappearance at the present time. Here it is. A daughter of infinite light, dwelling in a high and lofty aeon beyond time and space, one day came to gaze down into the swirling mists of darkness that stretched out below her dwelling place. Deeply within the mass of dark vapor, she saw a light, dimly shining in the darkness. Drawn by the vision, by this vision, she descended alone into the nether regions and searched for the light. At once she was surrounded by monstrous beings. This would make a good horror movie, at least at this point. She descended into the nether regions. At once she was surrounded by monstrous beings of terrifying appearance, who barred her way back to her own region, and with impious hands rent her garments and defiled her form with acts of lust and greed. She suffered and grieved, and she saw that her sorrows and pain merely increased the power of her captors, and that the lower her own confidence and spirits became, the more arrogant and fierce they waxed. But no matter how brutally they mistreated her, their chief objective eluded them, for they could not wrest from her the celestial light that shone in her being, a light which they desired to steal from her. Eluding their group, the Lady of Light descended further through the regions of chaos, where she beheld a system of strange craftsmanship within this machine-like system. She espied beings who contained within their nature light not unlike her own. Through those smaller and feebler in nature, she came to recognize that the faint light, the vision of which drew her to these regions, emanated from these small beings who were enmeshed in the great machine-like system which they called cosmos. Seeing her, these beings called out to her, saying, "Lady of Light, help us, for we are called humans, and we are captive of a system that is not of our own making, and we are sick unto death as we ride the great wheel of birth and death, and cannot escape from the terrible round of counterfeit life wherein we exist." And the daughter of infinite light descended into the cosmos and walked on the ground which they called earth, and she selected the wisest and strongest of will and mind among the company of humanity, and she had loved them and embraced them as a woman will a man. And the men who came to be known as knowers, Gnostics, knowers and prophets and friends of God, loved her and called her Sophia, wisdom, and sang songs of love to her, extolling her beauty and her power. And the result of her acts of love with these humans was that her own heavenly light passed into them, and they began to glow and shine with an ever-increasing radiance. And the monstrous guardians raved and howled in their fury, for Sophia had freely given of her light to the human race, while the dark ones could not obtain it at all. And they called her Prunikos, Greek, meaning lewd one, because she was there for all who wanted her, and cried from the rooftops of the cities, and called attention to her light in the streets. These are, of course, allusions to phrases in the Book of the Wisdom, in the wisdom literature. The Dark Lord said that she was a whore, for though a woman, she was not married to any man, and gave birth to no human offspring. The laws whereby they shackled humans to the wheel of their cosmos she disregarded, for she knew a higher law, a law of love which alone can increase the workings of the light in all beings. And the number of those who loved her and whose light was increased by her presence, and some even escaped the wheel of birth and death and rose upward to the light. And one day Sophia's celestial twin and consort, called by some the Christos, by others the Logos, descended in search of her and rescued her from the imprisoning dark lords. And Sophia ascended with Christ to her own high and lofty place. But she left her glorious image behind in the cosmos, the image of a woman, not under any law, and the property of no one, whose light and wisdom are accessible to all. Yet her image wore a black face, the better to show the light concealed within. For as it has been said, the light shineth in the darkness. The manifestations of her image were many. Venus, who was called Porne, again, it's a derogatory term. Mary Magdalene and the Lady of the Troubadours, who bestowed her light called Merci on those who deserved it, and not on those who claimed it by law. The image of Sophia, still hated by the dark lords and revered by the wise, can be found in the world. Such then is a condensed version of the legend of Sophia, and in it we can discern an image, indeed an archetypal image of the feminine that is indifferent, that is different from others. It is not the fierce mother of old, the dealer of life and death, neither is it the chaste virgin, the queen of heaven. It is the inspirer, the facilitator of gnosis, who is beyond all earthly rules and positions of society, the one who gives fully of herself and of the light to the deserving ones of the human race. We have thus an idea of the archetypal image that the Greeks called the hetera, as we shall see, and of course which was rediscovered in psychological form and included among the four feminine forms by Tony Wolff. As we shall see in subsequent discussions, it is closely related at a deep level with that of the Madonna of the black countenance, namely the Black Madonna. It is an image of the feminine that is neither the primitive, ambivalent mother of the mother goddesses of ancient times, nor the ethereal Madonna of medieval Christianity. It would seem that the individuation of the culture has outgrown both. Well, I wrote this years ago, so I can probably modify that. What the world needs at this time is not the image of a fierce and cruel queen, or a woman as wife or woman as mother, and even less as woman as warrior, but of a woman as a facilitator of consciousness. What we are dealing with here is a psychologically dynamic and feminine nature. Perhaps the time is nearing when we may expect a more widespread acceptance of this image, and even less its widespread proliferation in an active manner in society. Still, there appears to be an archetype rising, but how it will proliferate and how it will fare, that is still a matter of future development. And I will venture a suggestion that the excessive, the reductio ad absurdum, as we like to call it in Latin, when a certain, this is happening all the time. We come up with certain propositions that, make a certain amount of sense in our lives, in society and everything. But then we go on and we push them and we push them and we push them. And we, in so doing, they become something absurd. And that is what the Romans called reductio ad absurdum. And the reductio ad absurdum that has occurred, and which I believe, and I have a right to my beliefs like anybody else, that I believe that this is an unfortunate reduction. And that is the reduction of a doing away with and a confusion of the genders in humanity. Because you cannot do that without causing disruptions in the collective vision of the dualities. And I think that certainly by this time it is going too far. Not to even speak of the fact that numerous and perhaps innumerable people will come out of the present gender confusion in great suffering and great misery for the rest of their lives. Because the psychological changes which they have subjected themselves to, as well as physical changes, will undoubtedly cause that kind of suffering. But that is just, let's say, translating some of these categories into present conditions. But you know, whenever something really good is about to happen in this world, or let's say even I can testify to it, if we have a certain amount of insight into our own lives, if we observe our own lives, that when something really good is about to happen, or is happening, all kinds of disturbing and destructive forces move in, as if there is something in this universe that doesn't want anything good to happen. You know, this is symbolized, for instance, by in the New Testament by King Herod sending out his soldiers to kill all the children, because maybe one of them might be a great teacher. Maybe one of them might become the king of Israel, and then where will Herod be? You know, the usurper, the nasty fellow who he was. That's the way it is. And if we make ourselves prepared for that, then we are going to have a much more peaceful life. So whenever I'm trying to do something, or even participate in something that I think is really for the good, I realize that it's going to be a counter push. And we have to be prepared for that. Put on the armor of righteousness, as St. Paul says. And then maybe we'll be prepared for that, and we can fight those assaults off, and then something good will happen. But if we are just starry-eyed like little orphan Annie, you know, you remember the big eyes that she had? You know, whenever she was talking to Daddy Warbucks or so forth. You know, if we are just starry-eyed idealists of one kind, you know, idealists have done more harm in this world than anybody else, and they continue to do so. I might as well say a word about that. Why? Because what is an idealist? An idealist is who is in love with, or maybe not, maybe just following his or her own ideas. Now, his or her own ideas are the ideas of a fallible, imperfect, and often, most of the time, unenlightened being. When you follow your own ideas, you are following an unenlightened being, because you are an unenlightened being. And when you do that, things are not going to turn out really, really well. So that is why it is, as Mr. Manly Hall was wont to say, and so as he said, we have to be informed regarding the wisdoms of the ancients. We have to, like Confucius said, we have to know and we have to follow that which has endured time for thousands of years and remained good. Then we are following something good, and we can add our own modifications to it. But if we fall in love with our own limited ideas, the results are not going to be very good. Or as Wilhelm Busch, the German cartoonist, wrote, und so weiter, doch das Ende ist nicht heiter. And so on and so forth, but you know the end is not going to be good. And this is the great problem. But you know, why does the idealist fall so much in love with his own ideas? Well, I already said it. Because they are his ideas. This is mine, all mine. I figured it out, that if we take everybody's money away and take some of it ourselves, then it'll be a better world. You know, all these weird ideas. But they are my ideas, and therefore they must be great. But of course, that is by no means the case. So this is the great problem. So no doubt, when something good is trying to happen in the world, when in some fashion, and we'll go into that further because I have some, what to me is very interesting material, that it is even visual, that when something really good is trying to happen, like a return or a partial return of Sophia, there will be all kinds of weird ideas coming in to mess up the process. It's not. Look at the symbolism, say, of the Bible, or even of the coming of Jesus. Well, all right, he has one day of triumph, and that is represented as Palm Sunday. He rides into the city, and Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who cometh in the name of the Lord. By next day already, he is being tried before the judges, and the people are there. Crucify him, crucify him. And there weren't such an awful lot of people around there at that time, so they are the same people. Vox populi, vox Dei. Well, I don't know, the voice of the people is the voice of God. Often the vox populi is vox follis, the voice of the fool. To keep that in mind. Keep it in mind in the next election. Maybe you won't join the fools, but that's how it is. So when something is trying to happen in this cosmos, when something really great and really good and really helpful is trying to come in and make itself known, then we have to be very humble, we have to be very perceptive, we have to develop an archetypal vision wherein we can tell, yes, this is something real. This is something that is going to good. This is something that I am going to follow through on, And then perhaps something good may happen. Because only the inspired act of the human being is productive of good. That which is not inspired is not productive of good. It may have practical arguments, it may have political arguments, it may have dogmatic arguments, but it is not good and it will not produce good. And that is why there is so much evil and so much misery and so much stupidity in the world. Because we follow will-o'-the-wisps, which are largely dreamt up by our own ideas and probably conjoined with the ideas of others who are not much brighter than we are. But something may be happening. The black goddess may be coming out of the dark, and we may perceive within the dark shadow her light. And she may even be the maiden of infinite light, who according to the ancient legends has come from the aeons, who inspired all the wisdom and all the good, even in this imperfect world, and who promised that she would never leave us completely, and that she would come back when we called for her. May we keep calling, and may our calls be answered as we expect them to be answered, by wisdom, by goodness, by truth, and then indeed all shall be well. So I thank you very much, and I promise you, you may not get as excited about it as I am. I promise you an interesting sort of psychocosmological insight that has come to me and that I think is very valuable. So thanks very much for being here, and come back to it.